Welcome to Designing Cities for All, another episode, and it's part of our 2-year-long activity and research program,
where we take a deep dive into designing products, spaces, and systems for all. Just because you feel safe, or you feel welcome, or you feel included, doesn't mean that everyone else around you feels the same way.
We don't stand alone. We're not individuals that somehow a planet or an island, you know?
And I think that's the beautiful thing of a diverse society, that everyone can add something from out of their own experience.
Things won't change just if we just let things happen.
I think if you can build relationships and use design as a tool to build those relationships, the better off we're all going to be.
Everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned.
Belonging is a very, very important concept.
You can try to take someone's place for a while, but you don't have the lived experience.
Let's begin by acknowledging similarity and affinity.
Be a person, not your role.
I think inclusion is not a choice.
Inclusion happens by design or not at all.
In order to create truly inclusive public spaces that are accessible to everyone, we have to underline what everyone actually is.
Real inclusion, it's got nothing to do with the norm, but it's like something that we create from all different perspectives.
You know, so even when we bring everybody at the table, does everybody's voice count the same?
Because it's a big question of who tells these stories.
You know, the more I explore about other cultures, other religions, is the more ingredients I have to make the architecture and to answer the questions I get from society.
Not fitting in was a blessing, or I would have turned out just like you.
Such a lovely video to watch, actually, even after the third time. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lindsay Beda. I'll be moderating the conversation today. Really happy that you're here. Also, you watching online. What you just saw was a wrap-up of the first year of Designing Cities for All, a 2-year research and activity program that takes a deep dive into designing products and places and systems for all, that work for all. And next to the designers that you saw, the scientists, the experts, the educational institutions, other partners, there's also 6 fellows that were invited to curate part of the program. And the current fellows that we're speaking with tonight are the Chrononauten, the Chrononauts. And in their Designing Cities for All fellowship, futurists Edwin Gardner and Christian Frino rethink the shape of trust and democracy in this digital day and age. And together with you, the guests and the audience, we're exploring how to build new architectures of trust in this day. And so in general, in this series, because it's a series, the 3rd episode today, we've looked at what new architectures of trust look like, trust in sources, trust in other people. And now we're really going to speak about governance and how can we build a new foundation for, you know, our digital society and how we trust institutions in that. So we will reflect on that with the Chrononauts and with 3 wonderful speakers, and we'll speak about ideas like commoning, you know, that new way of looking at democracy that we're all still defining and figuring out, and key questions like, you know, how if we design new governance structures, who should have the power in that, and how do we get there in a safe way and in an inclusive way? And to speak about that, we have 3 guests, as I said. Here to my right is Martijn de Waal. Martijn, you're a professor of the research group Civic Interaction Design at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. You focus on the relation between digital media and public space, specifically on civic media and digital placemaking. Right?
That's correct.
Nice, fantastic. So we're going to hear all about that in a bit. Then joining via Zoom, we're really grateful to have Lisa Talia Moretti. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here with you all tonight.
Definitely. Lisa is an associate lecturer at the Institute of Management Studies at Goldsmiths, the University of London, also visiting lecturer at Cardiff University in the School of Journalism, PR and Cultural Studies, and also currently working with the Ministry of Justice in the UK on projects like the power of attorney. Is that correct?
Yes, and just one more thing to add. I'm a research fellow at the Governance Lab in New York University.
Right. Oh, perfect. Wow, you're so international. All over. Wonderful. Thank you so much for making time to join us. And then lastly, we have Tara Karpinski. Tara is a researcher, designer, and one of the founders of the design collective, the Pink Pony Express.
Yes.
Yes. Pioneers in research through making, as I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
And working at the intersection of research, design, and society. And you also have a couple of research roles in other places, right?
Yeah, that's true. So I work as a researcher designer for Avans University of Applied Sciences by the research group situated Art and Design. And also as a researcher designer for civic interaction design
together
in
with
Amsterdam,
Martijn.
together with Martijn.
Yeah, wonderful. We have a team here. We also welcome you here today. We would love to involve you in the conversation, also those watching from home. For that, we have Mentimeter. So if you're watching from home, you can go to menti.com and use the code 23293830. You see it now on the screen as well, and you can ask your questions. And if you're here, you can just raise your hand if you have a question in the question round, and we'll make sure to include yours as well. All right, let's get started with you guys, Edwin and Christian.
Yes.
Yes, hi, welcome. How are you feeling today?
Good. Yeah.
Good.
Looking forward.
Excited? Okay, great. We're discussing how to build public governance in the digital age today. You know, that's kind of what the two previous sessions also led up to. Why did you want to include this topic? Why was it important in the series?
Well, I mean, the public domain is a, let's say, very broad and big space.
Definitely.
And we've discussed in the previous sessions, let's say, how we make, well, truth, or how do we agree on what is true and what is a fact. And the second one was more about social discourse. So how do we actually also meet online? Because, of course, social media is actually a place where social discourse is happening, and what's the character of that. And, of course, another important part of the public domain is making decisions together. And, of course, we live in a parliamentary democracy, and we also notice how deeply our politics is intertwined with media and its public domain. So there's a very direct dynamic between what is true, what is a fact, how do we talk online, and how do we make decisions, and what values are represented in our parliaments. But also, does our representative democracy, is it still fit for the future?
Yeah.
So if we're moving into a digital age, is the parliamentary democracy fit for that? And I think, that's what we want to explore today. How could it change? How does our decision-making and governance relate to this new information sphere we live in now?
Right, exactly. Interesting. And why do we have these three guests here tonight? What do you hope they will add?
Well, I think they all have a perspective on, let's say, the social sphere and how we make decisions together. Like, I think on a small scale, like from a neighborhood to bigger scales. And it's not just about, let's say, making decisions. It's also about the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So also a court of law, or I don't know, the food authority, or the securities for financial markets. These are all institutions which find their foundations in kind of a democratic society. And I think all of these go from, let's say, the very institutional and abstract to basically how do we, let's say, practice democracy as a culture every day with each other in, from the sports association to the neighborhood, where does the playground get? And I think, democracy is also a culture. It's not just a system.
And what would be fantastic if that would happen in this conversation?
I think for us, it's basically new insights. And we've been thinking mostly about this interaction between what the digital is doing to like all these issues. And I think every night we've invited experts who bring their point of view, their expertise to the table, which provides us new angles and insights to enrich our thinking and scenarios.
Great. Thank you, Edwin. Let's go to our speakers and get to know you a little bit better. Martijn, we just introduced you, and your research very briefly is focusing on that relation between digital media on the one hand, the public space, and then specifically civic media and digital placemaking. Maybe we need some defining here. What, for instance, digital placemaking, what are we talking about when we say that?
Well, placemaking we like to see as the process through which people who live, for instance, in a neighborhood, how they sort of feel connected to their neighborhood because that the place where they live has some sort of a symbolic meaning to them. They feel attached to it. They experience as a sense of place. So all the processes that can help to bring that out. But it's not only the relation of an individual to the place, it's also the relation that individuals or people who live in a neighborhood have with each other because they all feel somehow responsible or connected to that same space.
Yeah. And
you can do that, of course, as an architect or a social designer by organizing a festival in the street that enables people to to get to know each other. You can erect a monument or something else. But you can also use digital media. You can either build online fora, for instance, where people can talk about the neighborhood, or you can use some hybrid forms in which you use, for instance, all kinds of data harvested from social media, and somehow you bring that back in a particular physical place. Or, for instance, another example that just pops into my mind is, I think in Utrecht a few years ago, the architectural firm Okra, they used light installations to bring out the borders of the ancient Roman parameters of the city, right? So you have the city, but you add an extra layer with digital media that brings out, particular symbolic meaning that helps you understand that place
where you are,
extra depth or meaning.
Yeah, interesting. And civic media, just in one sentence for those of us who don't understand what that means.
Well, we see civic media as all kinds of digital media that people use to organize themselves around issues of communal concern. That could be, for instance, people who care about the climate and they use a digital platform to get together and discuss it and organize an action, for instance. It could also be people who care about the environment and say, okay, we want to design our neighborhood or our houses in a different way. Let's start a housing co-op, but really design it based on very different principles than that's been done in the market. And then what kind of platforms or tools can they use to guide them through that process?
Right, okay. And just going back to the placemaking, because you now, you spoke about hybrid forms and bringing digital in to connect to the place where you are. In a world that's increasingly really sometimes purely digital, what does placemaking mean there, if it has nothing to do with actual place anymore?
For me, nothing, because for me, placemaking is really about
location.
The location, the physical place where we live and that we want to connect it to. So there is other ways of organizing, not place-based in particular communities. Right. I wouldn't call that placemaking.
Great. And lastly, in terms of definitions, we're also going to be diving into this idea of commoning today. The digital commons as well. Can you briefly talk us through what that means, commoning?
Yeah, well, commoning is a very complex concept that's been used in very many different ways. So I could talk about it for an hour, but I'll try to keep it short. I think the way we define it is on 3 different layers. The first layer is basically a bounded resource, like a housing co-op or an energy community. So you have a particular resource and you can exclude other people from it, and you want to organize it with a group that actually owns that research collaboratively according to principles that are based on use value and social value, and not based on market value, right? So you build a house together, not because you want to make a lot of money on the real estate market, but you want to provide a way of affordable living for people in the neighborhood and strengthen social relations between the residents, for instance. That's one way of commoning, organizing these resource communities. I guess the second way that people talk about commoning is examples of processes where people who live in a particular city take over a resource that somehow is already a public resource, or in some cases a private resource, but it has lost its meaning in that way. For instance, let's say a square in a neighborhood that has not been taken care of by the government very well in the last so many years. So people organize themselves. Okay, let's get together, take ownership, and clean it up.
Yeah.
Or there is a vacant lot somewhere. Nothing is being built on top of it because there is a project developer waiting for the land price to rise. And people say, well, it's a private
create
resource.
A community garden.
Yeah, let's create a community garden.
Yeah.
Let's bring it back into sort of a public domain. And a third and last example of commoning is even more abstract and philosophical. You see that legal scholars are talking about commoning as a principle on which our legal system can be based. For instance, right now, the example that I just gave, our legal system is really based on property rights. So if you would go to a court, then this landowner would probably get his right of way, right? Because legal property is very important. Now, there are some scholars who are introducing the notion of commons as a way of understanding the city and collective resources. So you can say, well, of course, there's private property, but if the common or the public interest is really more important, then the private property doesn't really count. It's not that important anymore, and we're going to give this land, or at least the use rights, to the people.
Yeah, great.
But that's very experimental legal.
Yeah,
thinking.
Thank you, Martijn, for this mini lecture to get us all on the same page. Really helpful. Tara, I would love to understand, well, first of all, the Pink Pony Express. Why did you start it and what does it do?
Good question. The Ponies was established 11 years ago because I remember at that time there was a group of designers, mostly in Amsterdam, who were really interested in Detroit, Edwin being one of them. And we started with a quite big group talking about what was happening in Detroit about 10 years ago. And at least as far as our collective is concerned, 4 of us stayed with that project and applied at the time to Fonds BKVB.
Okay.
And traveled to Detroit and lived there and worked there for, I think, on and off about 2 or 3 months one summer. That's how it started. And what we were looking at was actually, what we were looking for were sort of positive ways of dealing with crimp and what was happening in the city. I had to think about it when Martijn was talking about like this claiming public space, because when we were in Detroit, one of the things we first noticed was how abandoned lots were being mowed by private citizens just because this idea of like landscaping and public aesthetic was really important for the spirit of the neighborhood. So since Detroit, we've worked on different locations in the Caribbean. We were in Tokyo with you, in Russia. And our work is about points of friction between, let's say, civic groups and government, local government, or also sometimes national government.
Right.
And what we do is we zoom in on those points of friction, or you could call them disillusionment. And we live and we work long-term on the locations where that's happening.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Very interesting. What do you think, from all your experience as well, is the role of design in making sense of the challenges we face, such as the topic of today, like institutional mistrust in our digital age? How should we see the role of design?
Well, I think there's different roles for different designers.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I think my role as a designer or with the collective is to make things that are not noticeable or visible tangible. So it's kind of revealing this invisible layer of information that's quite important to the place where you are and maybe functions as like a larger metaphor for a certain issue that you're dealing with.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Lisa, I would love to bring you in as well. First of all, the basics. You call yourself, or that's what I heard, a digital sociologist. I wonder what that means, and also what a digital sociologist does at a place like the Ministry of Justice.
Yeah, hi everyone. That's a great question. And it's a question I get asked a lot. So when I introduce myself, everyone says, "You're a what? Can you say that again?" So digital sociology is essentially about coming to understand society in new ways. And we do that by studying what emerges at the intersection of social theory, social life, technology, and content or information. And the reason digital sociologists are needed in places like the Ministry of Justice is because predominantly the user research discipline has emerged as being quite focused on individuals and designing for the individual end user.
Right.
Whereas what digital sociologists do is we're really interested in those social structures that operate within society. So we know that as people, as individuals, we are not just these siloed entities making our way through the world. We are bounded to one another through series of different relationships.
Yeah, exactly.
And sociologists essentially don't just design for users, we design for relationships.
Interesting, very. And not only are you also call yourself a tech ethics advocate, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What does that mean, and what do you work on in that capacity?
Yeah, so for me, I believe very strongly in thinking about the choices we make as designers, whether we are design researchers or UX designers, etc. And for me, design is about being a choice editor. And when we think about the way that technology is weaving its way into our lives, into our social structures, technology is increasingly becoming a factor in what determines how we live a good life. What determines how we run a good government? What determines how we run a good public service? And when we talk about this idea of good and what good looks like, we are essentially moving into the space of ethics. And ethics is about what choices do we need to make in order to live a good life, in order to run a good government, in order to host a more inclusive public space. And so when I talk about being a tech ethics advocate, it's about opening up and facilitating conversations that allow people to be much more cognizant and reflective of the choices that they're making within the design process, and being really reflective on if that allows for people to live a good life.
That's very central, I feel, to the conversation as well. And lastly, there's these underlying issues that you work on in terms of diversity and inclusion, for instance. Can you shed a bit of light on what role diversity, inclusion, what role they play in building a new architecture of trust or a new form of governance?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've seen a lot of, and when we've built products and services, is that very often we exclude certain types of populations. So we exclude certain minority groups, or we exclude particular genders, or we exclude people with particular abilities or disabilities from those conversations. If we are truly to build new, fair, democratic, equitable governance systems, we need to think about the way that technology is going to be touching all of our lives, not just some of our lives. That is to say that we need to design for the many, not just the few.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. Thank you. Such interesting guests. Really wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Before we really get into the conversation with you, we will go on a brief trip to the future with the Chrononauts. And again, just to repeat, if you have any questions and you're watching online, you can go to menti.com, type in 23293830, and everyone here can just ask their questions. And for now, let's give a hand to Christian Fruno.
Yes, thank you. So the scenario I'm going to present to you is sort of a recap of the scenarios we presented last Monday and the Monday before, and it will build on that. So let's begin. The last Monday and the Monday before that, we embarked on a time travel journey to the year 2093. Here, in 2093, we met Jopie Chef Arends. We learned Jopi was one of the most prominent media scholars of the late 21st century. Here we see her being interviewed by a journalist. Jopi is the one on the left. Listening to Jopi, we discovered how society has changed in the century after the invention of the World Wide Web, which made the internet an omnipresent social reality. It was, in many ways, a watershed moment. She explained that the arrival of the World Wide Web created a brand new space for information sharing and community building. Suddenly, people could connect with everybody, everywhere, all the time, in real time. It was magical. I see the... But it was also profoundly disruptive to the old ways and the known institutions. Ways and institutions were part of a much older information culture, an information culture that was based on the printing press. Jopi explained to us how, with the arrival of a new information technology, a new public domain emerged, a place where people connected with other people with whom they shared information and aligned values and norms. Something in society began to brew, to change, and to mutate. This new public domain, where information literally flowed with light speed, built up immense pressures on the institutions of state to be more efficient, more effective, more transparent, more inclusive, more honest, and more democratic. But she also explained that, at first, people didn't know that this was happening at all. They were under the impression that the internet was just a cool, everyday gadget. Most were oblivious to the fact that something monumental had shifted, which resulted in a societal misalignment, in confusion and chaos. This was the time of the Wild Web. The time of the Wild Web was a time when social trust was at a low point. Misinformation proliferated, communities fragmented, politics became polarized, and public institutions were increasingly seen as inadequate, not up to the task. Some people believed the most outrageous things, encouraged by shrewd and opportunistic politicians whose modus operandi was to sow division and rule. Around 2016, it became clear to most that the internet was somehow at the heart of the chaos, but they still didn't understand how, and thus how to fix it. They didn't have a good conceptual framework to deal with it. The concept of a public domain wasn't new, but society never had to consciously deal with it before. Jopi explained that the public domain that people were used to at the time was that of the newspapers, the magazines, and the TV shows, and that this public domain grew organically in the many centuries after the invention of the printing press. It wasn't consciously designed. It sort of just emerged, came into being. And if there was any design to it, it was long forgotten knowledge. Therefore, people took it for granted. So, at first, people treated the online sphere as a large marketplace, and when things went wrong, they reverted to known market regulation laws. It took a while, but eventually people realized that this wasn't a constructive way forward. The online sphere wasn't just a marketplace. It was also, and perhaps much more so, a public domain, something vital to democratic culture. When they realized this, they also slowly, excruciating slowly, realized that it should not be regulated as an exchange of goods, but governed as a communal space. In the end, they figured out a public domain did three things. It created a space where people, 1, shared information and produced a shared truth. 2, align values and norms and produce a shared sense of belonging. And 3, provide both the cultural legitimation and the technological foundation for public decision-making and public execution. Inspired by this insight, the European Union built the Universal Data Commons, a public data chain that consisted of individual or organizational data lockers that were embedded in a single network. It came online in 2029, and it was mandatory for all European citizens. Because they expected a lot of distrust from those online denizens who thought everything coming from the old institutions being totally evil, they made the chain a common, governed by drawn members. In the years that followed, other countries built their own compatible systems. The Universal Data Commons did a couple of things, which changed all things. First of all, it made it possible for journalists, scholars, and scientists to publish journalistic sources and research data in their own vault and of their organizational vaults. These sources could then be linked to related publications that verified, complemented, or falsified them. This created a radically transparent chain of evidence. It became the tool that forced open journalism, open science, and open governance to become the operational standard. It also re-established a certain social trust in its methods of truth-finding, data sharing, and information ordering. This radically transparent chain of evidence also created a new truth culture. It became a key resource in finding sources, correlating data, and finding new connections. You could even make a living as a chain weaver, verifying or falsifying sources, organizing authentication, and in general deepening trust through connecting sources and augmenting data. Children started to learn in school how to check the chain and how they could verify, falsify, or complement what they found with corroborating or contrasting sources. They learned to interpret the information they found online. Was the photo of a burning house an original? And if it is a derivative, how so? What does the data chain tell you? Is it connected to other chains of evidence? If the flames are added later and the images were used to disinform people, what is your choice of action? Another thing the Universal Data Commons did, according to Jopi, it cemented individual data ownership. The Individual Data Commons created data and login standards which forced platforms to become interoperable and which broke the big online monopolies and cleared the way for a diverse online ecosystem of small, mutually compatible platforms. The network and lock-in effects migrated from big tech towards the Universal Data Commons, which became basically the digital base layer. And this also reestablished a new common platform where people could meet, greet, and bond. The Universal Data Commons also had the advantage that login could only be done by verified identities, which created a known public. People could still operate pseudonyms, but they could no longer operate anonymously. This limited online bullying and intimidation and created a safe online space. The Universal Data Commons also allowed for contextual privacy, which means that you only share the information that is needed in a certain context. This made society's need for radical transparency and the individual's need for privacy mutually compatible. So, after the introduction of the Universal Data Commons, the internet basically became a much healthier public domain, where recognizable members of the citizenry could engage in a shared interoperable environment in truth-finding and in community building. But as Jopi pointed out, that still left the last function of a healthy public domain unchecked. How would the Universal Data Commons transform political decision-making and public governments? The answer came in time. People realized two things. They realized that every time the information density in society became more intense, public organizations had to become more transparent, more objective, and more trustworthy, and public decision-making had to become more democratic. Because the Universal Data Commons secured a more transparent, objective, and trustworthy ecosystem, they could build trustworthy platforms for public decision-making and execution that catered more towards the talents and fascinations of the people who did the work. In the old days, organizations were built upon the trusted work ethos of the professional. People trusted the professional to be objective and impartial, to do his or her job despite his or her subjective feelings and thoughts. Although you didn't really know if the professional in question was doing his or her job, you trusted her anyway. You believed her or he or she was there for you, which was, as we all know, not always the case. The Universal Data Commons created a transparent environment where more was known, more was accountable. And this new transparency created a space where a new work ethos could be developed, craftsmanship. Professionals simulated objectivity, so people would put their trust in them. Now people trusted the information in the Universal Data Commons, and workers could be more like themselves, which allowed for more artistry and authenticity. This cultural shift made new collaborative platforms possible, and it soon became clear that bottom-up cooperative projects were much better suited to the on-chain economy than static hierarchical bureaucracies. This new emerging collaborative culture also translated itself to how governments organize themselves. Besides open science and open journalism, also the practice of open government emerged, where all policy documents and memos were published on-chain and where all decisions were transparent and under scrutiny. The civil servants considered themselves no longer professionals. Most professional civic servants were cogs in the machine, above all loyal to the department and its political master. But as civic craftsmen, they professed above all loyalty to the public. If all the documents were not already available on-chain, they would all be potential whistleblowers. Finally, Jopi explained to us that in 2060 the European Union and its member states ended the practice of elected professional politicians. Parliamentary democracy was the thing of history. From now on, drafted citizen assemblies would be responsible for public decision-making. And because most people had extensive experience with cooperative decision-making, these assemblies were very boring affairs. No more crazy rhetorics, no more opportunistic power-grabbing maneuvers. The need for re-elections no longer warped public decision-making, and because everything was on-chain, the concept of backroom politics was soon forgotten. Obviously, most people didn't like being part of a council. They had better things to do. So they were extremely well reimbursed for their efforts. A couple of months assembly duty earned a couple of years living money. At last, Jopi explained that within an information-dense society, decision-making needed to rely on very diverse assemblies. All physical and neurological conditions known to mankind and all kinds of cultural backgrounds would be represented, as well as, obviously, the people most affected and interested in the problem. In this way, the decision-making process could take advantage of the widest variety of experiences, angles, insights, and intelligences. It could take into account all that humanity had to offer. Diversity replaced the old ideologies. And by bringing people from all walks of life together around a common problem, community was produced in a very inclusive way. Well, that was the scenario.
Thank you very much, Christian. Interesting, and I'm curious, just an open question to all three of our guests. When you hear the scenario, what's the thing that lights up in your mind?
I think it's an amazing scenario, and I think part of the work what we do at Civic Interaction Design is actually try to come up with very early version prototypes of some of the things that you're sort of painting for us towards into the future. And at the same time, I also think maybe there is a piece of the puzzle missing, and that has to do with your picture of the campfire, right? I think your scenario is very much based also on a very rationalist interpretation of the public sphere, where we all come together as so actually we lay sort of our personal identity away at the door, you know, and we come in and we talk about the arguments themselves. Of course, I think there is another way of looking at the public sphere, which is more about sort of, which is the picture in the middle, which is more sort of the ritualistic aspects, right? If it's a place where we come together and we celebrate that we are a community and that we actually belong together, and it's not so much about rational discussions, it's more about, I don't know, having a party or a parade or a ritual or something like that. However, I think for that you need something in the middle, right? Which is the campfire, something around which we assemble, or you need, at least in your imagination, be connected to those other people and have a base that indeed we are a public, all of us together, right? So how do we go from a situation where you could say, I guess, sort of, since the printing press and mass media has created national publics, right, showing us as belonging to a national public, you could say that what the digital media do is actually tearing us all apart, right? Making us very sort of atomized individuals or linking us in our own sort of small, interest networks or identity networks, right? So how do we go back? Because I think, in a way, I think your concept really shows a really interesting direction to sort of solve the problem with privacy and sort of the information and all that checking. But how do we sort of bring the ritual collective side sort of back so that indeed we start to imagine that all of us have something in common? And
interesting, yeah. Before we go into that, because I think it's important because it's a very human aspect of the story, I would love to hear the other two, just your brief first reaction. Like, what does this make you think of, Lisa?
Thank you for that. That was really a fascinating story and scenario to listen to. One of the first things that made me think a lot about is, who's responsible within society to educate the public on these new types of emerging technologies, and who's responsible for creating the programs of engagement to get people really leaning in and engaging with them. So through some of the work that I've done, where we've prototyped really early kind of big concepts so big and new concepts for people, things like personal data stores and digital identity, you start to see very quickly that you need some kind of an education funnel or education program that allows somebody to first understand what it is that they're engaging with, and then to be able to feel comfortable enough to lean in and engage, and then to be able to actually, go end to end and use that within a service. So that was one of the big things that I first thought
that popped into your mind. How about you, Tara?
Thanks. It was nice to hear it another time. I thought about two things, actually. The first, I kind of want to, I think when you were talking about the chain and then the document in the chain and the access to the document and how the document could be permeable or not, I immediately wonder about the role of images or other forms of portraying data other than documents, because I think in terms of bridging different publics, that image can also play a really important role in how people understand together. That was one of my first thoughts. And secondly, I have maybe some questions about the context of use. And I think that goes back to sort of my research background and the belief or standpoint that the user experience can best be articulated in context. And then I think in these discussions, I'm always interested in what is the context that we're looking from. So this kind of, where are we? Mm-hmm. So we're in the digital space, but
where are we using it for?
Where is the physical space, and where do these places meet in this conversation? So what is actually the actual context of use?
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I'm curious, we kind of already started with that, but I mean, the point of this is also to enrich the scenario together, right? And really see like how could it come to life even more, or how could it possibly work? And Martijn, you already started saying like maybe that ritualistic aspect, or like what do we organize around, or as opposed to maybe the more boring, what you said of like, that could be interesting to explore a little more.
It may, because I think it's a valid point, and I always imagine that when such a infrastructure's in place, humans will start building their own party. And it made me think about, at the first Monday, in the first fellow session, we had somebody who did research at Bellingcat, and she researched QAnon. And those QAnon spaces, they looked a lot. They functioned as a public space in a way, because they tried to order information, and everybody who came in was felt very welcome. Oh, and their opinions were valued. So community was built, and they had all these rituals going on. So it was a sort of a semi-spontaneous space where that
came into
emerged. And I think you're right. And I think for a structure like this, for an infrastructure like this, you should create the beach, the digital beach, where people should start a campfire.
But maybe we can put it as also a more open question in terms of, enriching this scenario. Like what elements could all three of you think of that we could add, to embellish it? Curious.
Where shall we start?
Where do you want to start?
Where shall we start? I think
feel into the future.
Well, I think maybe one interesting thing, because of course now also internet is a place where culture happens, right? It's not, so it's an immense cultural producer of our media landscape today. And I think what, of course, now the problem is that a lot of the media that's made is on these proprietary and monopolistic platforms. So I think also what could be interesting, what starts to happen if culture is not just like a consumer product or content on YouTube, but starts to become connected also to true ownership and to community or to local context.
Yeah.
So, then it's not just anymore a kind of entertainment space or something, which I think now a lot of internet is predominantly seen as a shop, as one of the images shows. I think, of course, all these other things happen, but also how we talk about it. Of course, big tech and our Netflix and this is a kind of a very dominant image of it. And I think, if community and culture, you can get this more kind of decentralized and local, those things start to belong more together. I think in our mind that those are somehow very separate spheres.
Because the internet is indeed so commercial and profit-oriented, but
Well, in terms of associations. So of course, it's much more than that, but I think in a lot of our discourse, our first impressions are usually on that side of the spectrum.
Lisa, Tara, what are you both thinking?
Oh, I don't hear her.
Oh, sorry, Lisa. Oh, we didn't hear you for a moment.
Oh,
now we hear you again. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think maybe one of the ways to enrich this scenario further would be quite interesting to bring in an inclusion angle and look specifically at something like, data ownership. So we know that there'll be lots of people with this idea of data ownership who won't be able to own their own data because of reasons around their age or reasons due to a learning disability or something contextual that's happened in their life. So if we think about parents with children, how do we think about the relationship that is between that child and that parent? And what does data ownership look like within that relationship?
Yeah, good point.
With some of the work that I do at the Ministry of Justice, where people have cognitive disabilities or they have a cognitive impairment that has resulted in Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, and they have decided to appoint somebody else to make decisions on their behalf. Now, at the moment, within legislation, we don't have any law that says that somebody can take over data ownership on someone's behalf, but make decisions on their behalf. So in this idea of universal data commons, I wonder if there's a way for us to think a little bit about things like data stewardship, powers of data attorneys, or powers of attorney that revolve around data ownership and data stewardship, and also new emerging institutions that could exist, like some kind of public data commons or a data trust or a data cooperative that could steward and facilitate data ownership and access to data with those populations who may not be able to have the ability to own their own data. So, also thinking of people like asylum seekers, migrants, refugees, etc.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Tara?
Yeah, I was thinking about the campfire. Going back to this idea of the campfire and just kind of wondering, like, what is maybe the biggest challenge? I don't know if it's like building the fire, because I think a lot of the fires might already be there. So, like, is the role to discover the fire or like keep the fire going or facilitate the fire? But I find it quite intriguing, like this sort of boundary between having to sort of facilitate, like instigate cohesion or facilitate cohesion. I think maybe that's where I'm working towards.
Yeah.
And is it, I guess, from my role as the designer on the table, like, what is it we should be doing? Is it like finding the fires or lighting the fires or keeping them going? So I was in this kind of considering the fire.
Yeah. Do you all actually agree with the direction? Indeed, the universal data commons, the collaborative culture that results from it, the open politics, like, is that actually the way forward, you think?
I think for some of us, and I think for a lot of us not.
Right. Yeah. Can you say something about that?
If I think about the community, well, I can say over the past 2 years, I worked in 2 very different communities. One community was kind of homogenous, highly educated, sustainable community in Amsterdam, where I saw that people were actually sort of given or not given, or the opportunity was created to use platforms to manage their data, and they actually just preferred to knock on each other's door.
I think I live there.
Yeah, I think, yeah. And in another community where I worked, the whole conversation was not on the table. It was a completely different way of dealing with public infrastructure and reacting to it. So I think that in certain circles like this, we talk a lot about these futures, and they're of course very important and will become more widespread. But I think right now it strikes me as being for a very kind of small. That's why they're future scenarios, right?
How about you, Martijn?
No, as a future scenario, I think it's a very desirable one in many aspects.
Is it also credible?
Like I said, there is still missing links there. But maybe to highlight 1 or 2 things that really speak to me. For instance, one of the things is really this idea of detaching your identity from the commercial private providers that organize your identities and your reputation, and give that the power over that back to the people, right?
Yeah.
The interoperability, because I think a lot of some of the problems that we have right now is indeed sort of the lock-in effects of many of those platforms.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to migrate to other ones because you have to start all anew. So the sovereignty over data, I think that is really very, very important. A thing that I find still that I think, okay, how are we going to solve that? Again, is sort of how much trust can we put in the technology itself, right? Sort of how, as a citizens, can we actually know that we can trust this technology? Who's responsible for this? Indeed, is there some sort of an organization that organizes that in a transparent way, that is accountable in a way? What is the governance of the system itself? And of course, it's not so difficult to say a scenario. Okay, this is what it should be, but how exactly, are we going to organize and realize that? I think I think that's a really interesting path to start.
Yeah, I would love to explore that also by just some more specific questions also to each of you based on your wealth of knowledge and expertise, and see how we can apply that to the how, indeed. And Lisa, I would love to ask you, we spoke about in the recap this kind of transition from the age of the spoken word and then the written word and now the activated word. And it sounds like these words are very, important to people, as if we put our trust in the words. But is that true? Like, what additional evidence did we need maybe in those previous phases that made us actually trust the word itself?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we need to remember is that language and human action very often go hand in hand. So, if we, literally hand in hand, so if we look at some trust markers that have emerged within the past, so people originally used to shake hands to prove that there was an absence of weapons. So it wasn't just enough to say, I don't have a weapon. You shook hands, and that was a transaction, a physical action that you could say, you can trust me. If we think about the reason we cheers and chink glasses today when we do that, it was to prove that the wine wasn't poisoned, because by smashing tankards together, the wine would spill over into different cups.
Yeah, so interesting.
And you would say that, so again, like that was you saying the wine isn't poison, but you're also doing some kind of transaction to be able to do that. Fast forward into the world that we are today. In a lot of the research I've done, what I've found is that transparency alone isn't enough to increase trust within an institution or an organization. You need a positive experience, and also you need a continuous positive experience in order to build and trust over time. If that trust is unbroken, you need some kind of apology or strategy to repair that trust. The other thing that we found within research is that people have individual trust personalities. So some people trust very easily, and they trust very easily in their offline lives, and they carry that trust personality with them into their online lives. Other people are in reverse. So we need to also think a little bit about both those additional kind of communal aspects, as well as some of these more individual ones when we're trying to build trust online.
Yeah. What do you think that could look like in this scenario, for instance, like such a positive ongoing experience using what Christian sketched out? Just like a super small example of what you think could work or could function as a positive experience?
So I think people have a positive experience when something meets their expectations. Mm-hmm. So if you say to me that when you use this service, you are going to get this value at the end of the day, and I do receive that value at the end of the day within the time frame specified, you have met my expectations, and therefore I'm much more likely to have a positive and trusted relationship with you as an organization. Right. So a lot of this is about managing expectations, exceeding if you can, or just meeting expectations that people have in order to facilitate those positive experiences.
Yeah, so the expectations need to be very clear as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Martijn, back to places, actually. Some of your research looks into the use of AI in public spaces, for instance, when recording evidence to create safer spaces, right? I wonder how you think this chain of evidence theory might relate to these types of phenomena of creating safer actual spaces.
Are we talking about the trust that we have in those systems, or?
Yeah, I guess the AI in public spaces is also meant to create more trust, right? In that you're safe in a place, or that you are.
Yeah, that's one of the things it could do. No, actually, I was thinking at what we just heard, those different aspects of trust. I was reading an article today by Bodo Ballas, and he on digital trust also, and he said trust is actually it consists sort of three different prerequisites or aspects. One of it is familiarity. The second one is control, and the third one is insurance. And I think it relates a bit to what you just said. So trust can come from being familiar with people. So you see them every day, and you sort of recognize their pattern, so you expect that it will happen again. Control is about sort of the proof that you have. That could be the transparency part, or you can sort of look really into the details. And the insurance part is sort of the mechanisms that are in place that if things go wrong and your trust, works out in the wrong way, then somehow you'll get compensation.
Right, there are consequences when,
I was thinking of that indeed, when just transparency alone, it's not enough. You also need this insurance part where where you know that, okay, that if somehow the government still messes up, even though it's transparent, I need to know for sure that they will actually compensate.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that with the rise of digital media, probably the shift between those three different aspects sort of are changing also. I think we're putting more and more our trust into the sort of the control aspect, because we have more data and we can really check everything. So we maybe do not need to be that familiar with people anymore, or even familiar. You can come maybe from part of the data. And at the same time, we can, and we see that this insurance part is more and more organized by private parties. In the reputation systems, or when you rent out your apartment on Airbnb, then Airbnb says, "Oh, if your guests fuck up anyways, don't worry, we'll pay for
exactly,
etc., etc." Now, why am I saying this? I think that because if we sort of maybe put too much trust in, and that also comes back to sort of the public space. If we put too much trust in the control, we might lose out on the need for familiarity. But that familiarity also brings other positive aspects, like social capital, for instance. So I think, this is sort of an interesting shift, but we're not really sure exactly where that will bring us.
It's really fascinating, because it makes me wonder if we can still... You spelled out these three components of trust: familiarity, control, and insurance. I wonder if one falls away, if you can still call it trust, or does it become something else? If there is no familiarity, for instance, is it still trust, or is it just something that works,
I also wonder that, because if a trust is also something you feel if you don't know, if you don't control, but still you trust it to rely on it in a way. So there's also this not knowing aspect of it.
So okay, you mean
that's the trust part,
maybe,
right? If you know, then it's not trust. It's just you.
But you're saying that familiarity is maybe not necessary for trust?
You say control is maybe not necessary.
Maybe, yeah. It's it probably depends on how trusted you are.
Maybe the familiarity is needed to.
But I also
have faith.
Right? And
I
think they're all very good points. And I also wondered, because this system, this digital realm, is obviously, it's not on its own. It's an augmentation of our physical
actual
realm
world,
and our printed realm. Just like the spoken word and the printed word and the activated word will still operate next to each other, parallel to each other, and they will be interwoven. So I think a lot of the socializing or the socialization process will also just be around the table, around an actual fire. And the digital realm will be a sort of augmentation of that, or an extra layer on top of that.
I would love to bring Tara into this as well, also from a design point of view. Of these, I think it's interesting how we all know what trust feels like as human beings, right? But we're trying to really analyze what does it take, or what is it made of? But as a designer, how do you feel that something like trust or mistrust can actually be incorporated in the design process? How can you work with that? And not only maybe during the design, but also designing for, fostering trust in a system. How do you incorporate that?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
I think maybe somewhere to start is that in my recent research, I looked at communities where there could be what is described as a trust deficit. So a lack of transparency, which we discussed, and also a lack of accountability or contestability. So in those places, the question is, can you rebuild trust? Was trust there to begin with? And if it wasn't, what was there? And how do you translate that into a relationship of trust? I think in relation to that, these examples about the clashing the glasses or the shaking the hand are really, really beautiful. But in my work, what I see is that shared ritual or handshake is not happening between civic groups and the municipality. So they're both doing their own handshake or their own toast, but not really with each other.
Yeah.
So I think refinding that common ground or even restarting the conversation in a different forum or in a different way is, for me as a designer, a first step towards how you could come to a common interface, and not just an interface that's being designed from one specific perspective.
Gotcha, yeah. Yeah. Can you make that even like a little bit more concrete with an example? Maybe like
sure,
a design for that handshake between the civic and the government?
Well, I'm not that far yet in my latest research project, but maybe I could talk about what's happening now and why I think that's necessary. So maybe the most tangible example of designs for digital trust interfaces are from Sidewalk Labs, which is, of course, a subsidiary of Google. And they've designed a visual taxonomy based on their own iconic language, and it works with QR codes about technologies in shared spaces, which was designed with the intention to enable users in the context of use to be able to kind of converse or at least find out, oh yeah, there it is, a new layer of information about these systems that they're either subjected to or that they're responding to. What you saw then in the user test was that people didn't understand these systems at all. So it was very detached from their lived experience of technologies, from the way that technologies were being implemented, which was basically with a lack of transparency in neighborhoods, and that this was basically like a foreign language. So this is an example of how to solve it. I mean, it's not a successful interface, but it is an example of the kind of interfaces that are being put out there at the moment.
To create a shared language.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Are there any questions in the meantime from you in the audience? Yes.
I'll do one.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
First, is trust either relative or absolute? And does it matter whether you talk about relative trust or absolute?
Oh, there's a mic coming, sorry.
Oh.
Can you please repeat your question so that at least I can also hear it?
Talking about trust, I was wondering whether it matters if it's relative trust or absolute trust, which is very different, of course, depending on the system in which you're operating. You can think of totalitarian regimes which still have citizens with some form of trust because of lack of something else. So it doesn't matter in which type of context you are. And secondly, I was wondering about the data faults. You are radically changing the power paradigm from democracy or from government institutions towards the citizen. And something in my mind says it's not all good. So which downsides do you see to that?
All right. Who would like to take that up? Either of the two.
Well,
maybe
we. Well,
sure. I think Tara also had something to say, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe the the downside. So the last question. Well, I think the first downside I had to think about is the downside we basically have now. So in a way, Apple is also saying we're like, our consumer is the most important ever. Their privacy is the most important. We'll never give away your data to anybody. Also, no backdoors for the FBI or the government, whatever. So in a way, that's like the perfect data locker, right? I mean, you have to be able to buy an iPhone, let's say. But if you hook up to their system, you have your perfect data locker. But then you get strange things like them monitoring if you have child pornography on your phone or not, right? And then it's the question, who do you want to do this kind of monitoring? Is it a private company, or you want some kind of public institution which is accountable one way or another? So I think that's also, so the data locker also has to be embedded in a kind of institutional framework that, I don't know, if you are a suspect and there are enough reasons that you could do like a search warrant, right? A digital search warrant into your data locker. So in a way to have this kind of super absolutist approach, okay, it's like a sovereign individual, like no state, it's a kind of libertarian approach. I think that would be a bad version of a data locker. Then you get, basically becomes a place to hide everything.
But between the lines, I'm also hearing something about like in this very direct democracy, right, where the people are choosing where we're going, and we have giant things to solve as a society. Are there downsides to having that type of
I think one of the downsides I can imagine, if you think about citizen assemblies, is to how to coordinate. You have this concept of what's it, subsidiation.
Subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity. You solve the problem in the context
and at the level,
the level where the problem is located. So if you want to address everything within citizen assemblies, obviously you need to coordinate all those citizen assemblies. All their solutions need to be, they need to add to the same civic framework. I can imagine that being quite daunting to do. Now it's done in a sort of a hierarchical way, and we have like 150 people who make the laws here in the Netherlands. So I think that's obviously you can think of many things that would be quite challenging to solve. But I also feel that with the arrival of a new information technology, we need to think about new ways of public decision making and public organizing and public execution. And that's what a scenario does. So if there are any downsides, that's a good thing, because then we can address it and perhaps find another scenario that would deal with it more effectively. And about the question, I don't know if I never heard of absolute trust, because that's almost knowing.
Non-human.
Yeah, that's non-human, like Tara says. But I do know that I worked a lot in. You have this. I don't know if it's a correct stoffel, but you have something like you have low trust societies and high trust societies, and apparently we here in the Netherlands, or probably in England as well, Great Britain, we live in a high trust society. We, without knowing that institutions are there for our benefit, we just trust them to be in our benefit, and we give them our data because we trust them. Basically, we trust each other. We trust the public. We can walk in public space without having the feeling that we're unsafe. We're a very trustworthy society compared to low trust societies that are out there that are maybe governed more by fear or something else. And that also came up the last Monday. I feel that and now you feel like our trust in institutions is wavering. It's becoming, and I feel that we feel that it obviously has to do with the emergence of a new public sphere, and probably also with neoliberalism and all kinds of stuff, but also with the emergence of a very dense informational sphere. And we should address that sphere and not become more distrusted, because we don't want to lose our high trust ways of doing. We want to create the environment which we actually can trust.
Yeah.
I don't know if that addresses your question, but that's my assumption.
Well, I would love to go into it even deeper in this last part of the conversation, and really explore, some different kind of conditions that need to be in place if we were to build institutional trust, if we were to successfully create this even more democratic version of democracy, actually, than we have now, facilitated by the digital tools that will be available to us. First, maybe let's make a super quick inventory of what you think are in reality the most significant barriers to building institutional trust and to maybe shifting that power to civilians in this, in the future.
Yeah, I can maybe say I think that if the shift is made towards putting civic groups or individuals in governance roles, it's also essential to look at what is the sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And I think that this is not only a valid question in terms of our institutions today, but that paradigm will still exist if we shift to a citizen-driven mode of quote-unquote democracy. I mean, I think you see that in the current referendum culture, if it's Brexit or
exactly.
the latest Twitter referendum about whether Trump should go back online. I mean, these are also forms of civic interaction and empowerment. And I think that these, when you put citizens in those governance roles, they're also being influenced by the same factors that are influencing our institutions today.
Yeah. So maybe let's stick to because I realize it's two very different questions. Like, indeed, the barriers to building institutional trust, no matter the form, maybe, or whether it's as direct, like citizen-driven, or what are the if we think a little bit more freely, like what are the most significant
I have the feeling
obstacles?
that we do not have a common method of truth finding. That's one of the barriers, I think. And the other one is that we don't share the same space and where we align values. And that's not only online, it's in society in general.
Yeah. Lisa, oh, sorry. Lisa, did you have anything to add?
I think another big barrier to building trust is how do we hold the powerful accountable for bad behavior and behavior that we would just, consider as being completely outside of the norm. So I think one of the big things that is holding a lot of us back is seeing very wealthy, powerful people. And I'm not just talking about politicians, I'm talking about the wealthy and the powerful in general, who the general public feel, gets away with murder because they are well connected and they have money and privilege. And I think what kind of mechanisms could we create within society to try to ensure that the powerful and the wealthy get held accountable and also participate in a fair and equal way? I think another thing that holds us back is that very often those individuals are not seen to be contributing in a fair and equal way, whether that be from tax avoidance to being able to lobby, senior ministers and politicians to be able to table their agendas, and those tabled agendas may not actually be in benefit of the public good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, interesting. Some other aspects that I thought you might mention, but haven't yet. Terror, for instance, you mentioned before we started this idea of, especially in a digital world, things like structures become even more invisible sometimes. Like, how do things work? The structures in which we're supposed to trust, we can't even really see or understand them sometimes. Is there a way, from a design perspective as well, that we can combat this or do something about that?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the question, what is the role of the designer? And I think that there are different roles. For instance, with the ponies, we're working on a project now in Rotterdam about the mosquito in the Tarwewijk. And the mosquito, that's it, is a high-frequency instrument that emits a 21 megahertz tone that only people under 25 can hear. So these instruments are...
Because after 25, your hearing gets that bad?
Deteriorates, yeah. Some people can hear it, not many. And be lucky you don't, because it's really painful. But they're installed in public spaces to deter, like, hangjongeren, right?
Incredible.
And in Amsterdam and Utrecht, they've actually been found in violation of human rights.
Hangjongeren, Lisa, I don't know if you know the term, but young people who hang around.
Like hanging out.
Hanging youth.
Yeah. But they're not illegal, and also there's no legislation that governs them, like with other surveillance technologies, like cameras, for instance. That's interesting in this case because it means that the mayor, Abu Talib, can just implement them at his discretion. So there's a kind of Wild West culture around the mosquito. The reason I bring this up as an example is that in Rotterdam, the policymakers actually purposely did not inform the residents and the community about installing the mosquito. And when we asked them, what was your reason for doing it? They said, well, we think that they can find out through normal media channels. And whether you believe that or not, it is quite interesting, I think, from a design perspective. Why would the municipality not inform? And can you, as a designer, take on this role to inform? And what should that way of informing look like or be like?
Does that also have to do with that concept of contestability that you mentioned a few moments back?
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
can you maybe say what it is?
Contestability. Yeah, when I talk about contestability in terms of something like the mosquito, I'm talking about a localized feedback system, right? So you could say in a democratic society, there are contestability mechanisms. For instance, you could go to like a gemeenteraadvergadering, like a municipal meeting where you could voice your concern. That actually happened not with citizens about the mosquito, but with different political groups like the SSP and GroenLinks and Partij voor de Dieren. I think what's problematic about that is that, for instance, hangjongeren, that's not a forum that they feel comfortable in or often visit. So from a designer's point of view, you could think, what does an interface look like that could be situated where you could provide some sense of accountability or at least
you truly want to be inclusive. Yeah, thank you.
Well, we work with that term a bit as well in some of our research. Especially building on the work of Gert Kortum and Kars Alfring from TU Delft, who came up with this idea of contestable AI. So again, in order for us as citizens to trust black box systems such as AI, it's not just enough to explain how they work or make them understandable, but we should also be able to contest them. Now, of course, that's difficult.
If we don't like how they work.
If we don't like how they work, or but that's difficult because they're black box.
Yeah,
right? And that means that actually you need to think of this contestability not something that you only do at the end, but maybe already at the very beginning. So at the moment that you want to implement an algorithm, you design it for a particular purpose. For instance, you have a machine vision system at the place that you just showed with a camera that shows whether hangjongeren are present or not, right? Then that algorithm needs to be trained. You need to feed it data. You need to show them pictures of these are hung. I'm not saying that this is a good idea. Right?
No,
just
doesn't
to make sure. But just to give you an idea, you need to show the system pictures of what are hangjongeren.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it's very imaginable, likely that there will be a bias in those pictures that you will show to the system in the first place, right? So is already there a moment built in the design process that citizens or representatives of citizens can say, oh, wait a minute, let's contest that. Let's
that bias, exactly.
Yeah, let's see what is the
yeah.
data that you use there, etc. And then if the thing is operation and there is a certain outcome, you need to file to be able to sort of file a complaint against that. And then in the end, and of course we've not seen that very well, not in the Netherlands, if something really goes wrong, like in the Netherlands we had the toeslagen affair where based on algorithms, all groups of people became suspect by the government and they got cut off from all their subsidies and got huge fines, which was not just.
And very racist.
And very racist. There was no procedure in place where you could actually contest that and or a procedure where we're still in the middle of that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very undermining, of course, for the trust in government at large.
Exactly, in the control and the exactly. Yeah. And maybe also just to bring back that idea of commoning back into this, this creating a new digital democracy. And indeed, like if we're talking about commons, the way you were describing it earlier looks quite different in the digital context. But what do you think is important to think about in that regard? How could a digital realm become a commons?
I think that's a complex question.
Again,
what are we talking about exactly, right? Are we talking... Yeah, do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, maybe the way we imagined it here, which is obviously very limited, it's like considering data as a common resource. That's one, which is verified by all the other vaults. Two, that you create a system, and I found that somewhat missing in your three, what is it? Components of commoning is the actual commoning, the experience of commoning. That that by commoning, you become more democratic. You create a democratic, you internalize a democratic culture, which I also find interesting in this aspect, in this scenario. If you create a sort of digital commons and which forces a sort of interoperable, small time platform space, that it will somehow give the people the experience of ownership and community, which will probably, hopefully, translate into campfires and all kinds of new common cultures.
Yeah.
Which will create the experience of trust and commoning.
Given that we've come to the end almost of our conversation, I just want to ask one last question to Lisa based on this right here. Because you spoke about tech ethics, right, in the beginning. And maybe just to end on a high note in that sense, can you give us any example of, what good ethics of trust could look like in tech, or something that was built really ethically?
Yeah, so if it's okay, I'd like to use an example from my own work.
Of course, please do.
Not to say that I'm the most ethical person, but
you feel like it.
It's a really tangible example that I can use. So when I was working with the Ministry of Justice and designing digital identity within powers of attorney and looking at modernizing that service, one of the things that was really important for us was to make sure we kind of kept three major things in mind. The first thing was that we needed to make the service available for everyone. So this idea of a digital service, we kind of turned it on its head, and we said the service needs to be able to be accessed in both digital as well as other channels. So we had to design the digital service alongside paper channels so that people who couldn't access digital or didn't want to access digital could still access the service. So for us, when we approached this solution, digital was simply a channel for us. It wasn't the whole solution to redesigning the service. So that was number one. The second thing was that it was really important for us to be able to ensure that we were asking proportional evidence for somebody to verify their identity and to be able to make a power of attorney. So we did a lot of work with user research, but also through multiple stakeholder engagement across the multiple different services that the power of attorney touches, such as financial services, legal services, healthcare. And we asked a very broad and diverse range of individuals what that proportional identity and proportional evidence would look like. And we tested that very robustly. We also made sure that somebody could apply for a power of attorney using that identity, again, through both digital as well as online means. So you didn't have to only verify your identity online to be able to get that.
Right. Yeah. Another example of inclusion in practice, actually. Yeah. Thank you for that. As we round off, or before we round off, any last burning questions from you? All questions were answered. Great.
Hi, everybody. My name is Els. Thanks so much for a really terrific conversation. I'm a political scientist, normally affiliated with the City University of New York, and I do work on city governments and how governmental and non-governmental actors can work together to build institutional capacity for particularly immigrant representation.
Sounds awesome.
And integration. And so I am really interested in kind of urban bureaucracies and what they can do to kind of better serve immigrants, include them. And this is very much rooted in the now, even though I'm very fascinated by your scenario of the future. But these bureaucrats actually often don't want to be super transparent. And so they are motivated to improve the life of immigrants. And so the outcome is certainly more equitable and inclusionary, but the process not always is. So I'd love to hear what advice you could offer to these folks. What's in it for them to open up their process, that it doesn't harm the outcome, I think, that they're really focused on. And just to kind of mix things in, I think it's also good to think about different kinds of government officials, those that are more in a regulatory and disciplinary function. I think for them it might be even more challenging to build trust versus those who offer services and make things, you know, better for immigrants in a more kind of straightforward way by helping with language classes or helping them find jobs or those kinds of things. Anyway, hoping that makes.
Do you have anyone in specific that you would
No,
love
anybody.
to?
I'm looking at you guys, but you know, anybody.
Anyway,
so who
okay.
wants to maybe.
And whoever wants to, asking you to keep it concise.
Well, but I think what's in it for them, I think if you look at the original professions that were like lawyers, accountants, they had like a code of conduct, right? But this work ethos somehow also was extended towards people who work in the bureaucracy, because they also consider themselves professionals, although they don't have, well, a lot of them don't have a sort of code of conduct or things in place that will monitor their ethical behaviors. Yeah, probably they have something. Yeah, but what I was trying to say is, what's in it for them? How would their work look like if they would not be loyal to the organization so much, or to the political overlord that governs the organization, but if they were loyal to the public? If they were more, in the scenario we call it the shift from professionals to more of civic crafts people, that they were more loyal to their, I know that they're stuck, right? So this is, but I think this shift would be interesting for, I think there was also a discussion in the ministry of just the toeslagenaffaire, that people said, maybe we should think about, we should consider ourselves more craft people than professionals who just do what they're told, and be more like focused on their craft, on their mastership, so more beholden to higher values.
I think if I could also answer your question, I think one thing that could be in it for them is being an example. In my research, I looked at 3 different kinds of governance. So municipal governments, policing, and tech. And what you see is that they all have the intention to hold themselves to these higher values, but they don't know how to operationalize it. And I think that if that sort of golden key can be discovered, and there is an example, that's really a worthy pursuit. I know it sounds a bit like a carrot you're like dangling in front of a cart, but that how to do it is something that I think could be used as an incentive to kind of keep people connected to the process.
Yeah, maybe to add...
briefly?
Yeah, the futuristic aspect to it is that I think, because now in a way they are part of the machine, right? They play the role of the protocol to keep the bureaucratic logistics running. And if they can step out of that and become more the craftsman, and somehow the objectivity of the system is somehow digital, then they can go back to the streets again. And that's something we did in a workshop we had, a lot of people like urbanists working at the municipality. And there's a lot of fear also. Like, just talking to citizens on the street, like without filters, second intentions, or hidden agendas. And when they do, they're like completely surprised that, this is like very nice, and it was so simple, it's not scary at all. But somehow they need to shed the machine, the old machine, and somehow this new machine should help them. But of course, that's still in the making.
Thank you for offering all of that. Really, really good question. Thanks. Hey, we're going to truly round off. And I want to ask you both, Edwin and Christian, just in one brief sentence, what is and it doesn't have to cover all, but just something that's on your mind now. Like, what's a key or surprising takeaway for you from the conversation?
Well, yeah, many things. But what I'm thinking about right now is the question how to make the digital accessible or inclusive to those who are having trouble accessing it.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good question, which is, that's something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the answer to that. And I would love to hear or read more about it. Also.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really liked Lisa's additions of so it's data ownership, but also stewardship. I mean, it's a very layered, it's like an onion. But it's also, I think, if you connect that also to this idea of commoning, like what you were talking about, this shift in legal principles, which we have a very property-based logic in legal thinking. If that would move more to commoning, like a commons-based legal framework, and you connect that to stewardship and other kinds of transferring data, I think there's also a very interesting area that I just discovered through your
nice, great, thank you. Well, if I may briefly, summarize what we've been through in this conversation, and where we started, as we are maybe moving out of this kind of confusing phase of the wild web that we're still stuck in a way, we can ask ourselves some really interesting questions of how can we use all of this to make decisions, to practice democracy, to evolve in how we practice democracy. And then bringing in that design aspect of, and a designer as a choice editor, how do we make sure that those choices are ethical? What are ethical choices? What does that mean? Who defines that also? And then, of course, we went into the scenario where we kind of saw how it could work and how a true public domain could come into existence, and some of the really important elements that you all added to it was this ritualistic campfire aspect, the educating the public and making sure everyone can actually be part of this, the role of images, other forms of information, this aspect that we kept coming back to, inclusion, what does that mean and how does it work? And also not only inclusion, but also how to make it relevant for all communities. This need for a positive experience and this kind of refining of the common ground between the civic space and the government, and how do you really design for that? And of course, some great learnings on what does placemaking mean in this context? What does commoning mean? What does trust actually consist of? And how do we, in the end of our conversation, we spoke about how do we overcome some of the things that are barriers, the truth finding, the shared values, the accountability aspect, the contestability aspect, the visibility, and again, the ethics, and how to bring the ethics in based on also maybe I heard empathy, with people using what you are creating or what we are creating, hopefully. Together, if it's true commons. So thank you very much for a rich conversation. All of you as well, some great questions. So thank you, people watching at home. And this concludes our 3-part series, actually, with the Chrononauts. And we explored all these different faces of architectures of trust in the digital world. And Designing Cities for All will be back on Monday, November 28th. So next Monday, again at the same time at 8, with an episode around informal settlements and governmental attitudes towards them. And if you want to know more about the digital world and the world of the Chrononauts, then you can also still join us next Wednesday, November 30th at 8 p.m. as well, for a book club meeting, Designing Cities for All book club. And we'll discuss the book Internet for the People with the author himself, really exciting, Ben Tarnoff. We also invite you to keep coming to these conversations and keep them accessible for all. And if you want to help facilitate that, you could become a friend of Podcast Zwijger. You can scan the QR code that you'll see in a sec. Thank you so much for being here, for watching. And for more information on Designing Cities for All, you can go to dezwijger.nl/DCFA. Have a great evening. There's drinks at the bar.